FGO's most dangerous servant is just a few weeks away, so I hope your wallets are ready. Hello everyone, Soberoni of G&A Reviews here, with a spotlight for the servant who proves the old saying, if at first you don't succeed, just become a berserker. Arjuna Alter. We'll be examining his stats and skills, as well as going over pointers at how to utilize him effectively, and an overall grade, comparing him to how he stacks up to the other 5-star servants. So if you're ready to go Ultra Instinct against Karna, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and ring my bell, so that you can catch all of these servant spotlight videos as they go up, and you can help out the channel. But for now, on to Arjuna's stats. Arjuna Alter has a max HP of 13,837 and a max attack of 11,669, which becomes 12,835 due to his Berserker class modifier. Both his attack and HP are slightly above average for his class, and compared to all the other 5-star servants, Arjuna Alter has a considerably high attack stat and average HP. When it comes to his command cards, Arjuna has 4 hits on his Quick, 2 hits on his Arts, 4 hits on his Buster, and 4 hits on his extra card. He has an NP gain rate of 0.98% and a star rate of 5.1%. Overall, Arjuna Alter has excellent offensive stats without the drawback of low HP like most berserkers, which makes him much more balanced. He does suffer from some low NP gain due to his triple Buster deck, but his star generating is better than average for a berserker due to his high hit count. Taking a look at his skills, Arjuna Alter's first skill is Anti-Evil Unique Rank EX. This skill increases his own attack for 3 turns between 20 and 30%, and it increases his damage against enemies with a debuff for 3 turns between 30 and 50%, both depending on level. His second skill is Clairvoyance Transcendental Rank EX. This skill increases his Buster card absorption rate for 3 turns between 3000% and 6000%, and it also charges his NP gauge between 20 and 30%, both depending on level. And finally, his last skill is Lamplight of the Soul Rank EX. This skill grants Arjuna Alter Guts for 1 time or 3 turns, reviving him with between 1000 and 2000 HP, and it also recovers his HP between 1000 and 2000 every turn for 3 turns, depending on level. As for his passives, Arjuna Alter has Madness Enhancement Rank EX, which increases his own Buster card effectiveness by 12%, and Divinity Rank EX, which increases his damage by 250. Moving on to his deck and Noble Phantasm, Arjuna Alter has a Buster deck with Quick Arts, Buster, 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 and a Buster Noble Phantasm. His Noble Phantasm is Mahapralaya, which is an AoE Buster attack that deals damage against all enemies with between a 300 and 500% damage modifier depending on level, and it also reduces all enemies' Buster resistance for 3 turns between 20 and 60%, depending on overcharge. When it comes to his Ascension Mat requirements, Arjuna Alter is very fond of gold materials. For leveling, you're going to need 5 black grease pots, 6 magic lamps, 6 hearts of a foreign god, and 5 eggs. The black grease can be farmed at the northern cliffs in Agartha with a 20% drop rate. Lamps also have a 20% drop rate at the jail in Salem. Hearts of a foreign god drop at the Carter residence in Salem with a 12% drop rate. And the eggs are going to be a new Ascension Mat coming with Lost Bout 4 that are going to drop at the Dewar free quest with a 12% drop rate. For skill leveling, Arjuna is going to require 9 lamps, 9 black grease, 24 giant rings, and 10 eggs per skill. Giant rings are going to be best farmed at the Giant's Flower Garden in Lost Bout 2, where they have a 40% drop rate. When I referred to Arjuna Alter as FGO's most dangerous servant, I wasn't being hyperbolic. God Juna has earned his reputation for destruction. Although his stats may not look all that menacing on paper, they are very well balanced for his class. He may not have the strongest raw attack stat of all the berserkers, but in exchange, he doesn't suffer from the crippling low HP that plagues the class either. Arjuna's star generating isn't bad either, despite his heavy Buster deck, thanks in large part to his high hit counts. But what really sets Arjuna Alter apart from the other berserkers and offensive servants overall is his world-class skill set. Right off the bat, Arjuna Alter has a passive 12% buff to his Buster cards from Madness Enhancement, an exceptionally strong buff given that his deck is 60% Buster cards, which means he's going to get great mileage from his passives alone. But that's just the tip of the galactic iceberg. Arjuna's first skill, Anti-Evil, is an obscenely strong self-buff that increases his attack by 30% and further increases his damage by an additional 50% against debuffed enemies for 3 turns. The 30% attack buff by itself is already powerful given the skill's very short cooldown, but that extra 50% damage really pushes this skill into OP territory. It's not hard to debuff an enemy in this game. In fact, even Arjuna himself has a debuff on his Noble Phantasm, so he can proc this bonus damage all on his own, which means that 90% of the time, Arjuna is going to be receiving the full benefits of this skill, which is basically a mana burst fused with a monstrous strength. Keep in mind that these are two different buffs, so they do stack multiplicatively, which means that when you face debuffed enemies, Arjuna Alter has a 95% buff to his damage, which lasts for most of the battle, and that's before factoring in his passive. The damage steroids don't end there though. Arjuna also has Clairvoyance EX, a skill that boosts his Buster Card Absorb by 6,000% and gives him an immediate 30% NP charge. This skill is a better version of Raiko and Zerkerlot's Eternal Arms Mastery, since it gives Arjuna a very high chance to crit specifically with his Buster Cards, which is going to maximize the damage and remove some of the RNG. Like Eternal Arms Mastery, it also lasts for 3 turns and it has a short cooldown, which allows it to be active for most of the battle. But in addition, the NP charge that the skill provides gives Arjuna some excellent wave clearing potential, especially for a Berserker, since AoE Berserkers with a direct NP charging skill are rare. And finally, Arjuna Alter does have one defensive skill to balance out all of his firepower. Lamplight of the Soul grants him Guts and it heals his HP by 2,000 every turn for 3 turns. Now, Guts is not the sexiest skill, but it gets the job done. It's a hard defensive skill that ensures that Arjuna can survive most enemy Noble Phantasms, and the additional heal is quite good for bouncing back from near-death situations. There are a couple of ways you could build Arjuna Alter. If you want to use him as a wave clearer or a farmer, then you should max out Clairvoyance first for the better NP charge, followed by Anti-Evil for damage, and then Guts last. But if you want to prioritize DPS and burst damage for boss fights, then you can level Anti-Evil first instead. Arjuna's Noble Phantasm is an AoE buster attack that lowers the buster resistance of all enemies. The buster resistance down debuff is very strong. It starts at 20% and then it scales all the way to 60%. It also activates prior to Arjuna's Noble Phantasm, so his Noble Phantasm will get all the benefits from the debuff. The damage on Arjuna's NP is exceptionally good, easily beating out every other AoE Berserker. That high damage combined with his very good NP battery and his class make him a top tier wave clearer. He may not be able to loop, but he can hit over just about anything no matter how strong the enemies are, which comes in handy for some of the more difficult events and lost bouts. In addition to his Noble Phantasm, Arjuna Alter also sports nearly unmatched DPS and burst damage. As mentioned earlier, he is able to use his Noble Phantasm to proc that bonus damage on his first skill and give himself a gigantic 90% plus damage steroid for 3 turns. And that's on top of having a deck of super juiced up buster cards that are boosted by his Madness enhancement. Arjuna can also be used as a crit DPS thanks to his second skill, being a very reliable source of star absorb and his already decent star generating. With all these damage tools at his disposal, Arjuna Alter can quite literally demolish most enemies in the game, and he can absolutely trivialize most boss encounters just due to his sheer damage output. Arjuna is no slouch defensively either. His good HP stat, his heal, and his guts gives him enough resources to stick around longer than the average Berserker. With all of that said though, there's no such thing as a perfect servant. So what are Arjuna's weaknesses? For one, even though he does have a hard defensive skill, it isn't the best in the world and it does have a long cooldown, so Arjuna is still susceptible to dying quickly in more challenging content, especially if you're up against an enemy that has buff removal. But his biggest weakness is his overall lack of utility, because despite having so much offensive power, Arjuna doesn't really have a means of hitting over some of FGO's trickier enemies. He doesn't have invincibility pierce or ignore defense, and enemies who are heavily resistant or immune to debuffs can absolutely wall him. So finding the right supports to balance out these weaknesses and play to Arjuna's strengths is crucial. Servants who can provide Arjuna with additional NP charge and damage buffs are very good options to go with, especially if you're using him as a farmer. I recommend supports like Helena, Shakespeare, and Reynes. All three of them are capable of providing Arjuna with enough Noble Phantasm charge to push him over 50%, which means that he's going to be able to farm with craft essences like Aerial Drive. And in addition, they all give very good attack buffs to further beef up Arjuna's damage. Arjuna can also work well with servants who are able to provide crit stars, crit damage buffs, and additional defense, like Brynhilda, Caesar, and Osakabe Hime. Bryn and Caesar are going to be excellent sources of crit damage buffs for Arjuna, since he lacks one of his own, and they can also give him some good star generating. Osakabe Hime also has a powerful crit buff as well as damage steroids, and even an NP charge for helping with wave clear. Arjuna's Bond Craft Essence is Sculpted Object. It grants him 3 hits of invincibility and it increases his NP damage by 30%. This can be useful if you don't have that Canif Craft Essence and you want to play a bit more defensively. But otherwise, I would recommend using CEs that give starting NP charge, like Aerial Drive, Kaleidoscope, Beautiful Dreamer, and Demonic Bodhisattva, since they help tremendously with farming while also buffing Arjuna's damage. You can also use craft essences that bolster crit damage if you want to use him more as a standard DPS, like Joint Recital, Victor from the Moon, Starry Nights, and Heading Towards Trifas. In the future, I highly recommend obtaining the Like a Bird craft essence, which comes out next year. It's an excellent free craft essence for Arjuna Alter that buffs Buster card crit damage and passively generates stars. As for command codes, Mistress of Heaven is perfect for Arjuna since it buffs Buster crit damage. Overall, Arjuna Alter may not be perfect, but he is, in my opinion, the best at what he does. His pure damage capabilities are nearly unrivaled compared to every other servant. He performs exceptionally well not only as a DPS, but in challenge quests and boss fights as well, and is one of the game's best wave clearers. And because he's so self-sufficient with such high uptime skills, his damage never really falls off or becomes inconsistent. He does suffer from some fragility issues in longer battles, and his lack of utility can make it hard to get around some bosses who like to spam defensive skills. But all in all, there is no offensive servant who can do as much as Arjuna can, as consistently as he can. So Arjuna Alter gets an S from me. Like I said earlier, an S doesn't mean the servant is perfect, but it does mean that they are substantially better at what they do than every other servant in their rarity. And I feel confident in saying that if you have Arjuna Alter, there's nothing this game can throw at you that he can't handle. And those are my thoughts on Arjuna Alter. I should also mention that he only has 1 raid up, so if you plan to roll for him, it's now or never. But what do you think of Arjuna Alter? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing if you really enjoyed the video. Join the party over at our Discord, chill with us on Twitch, and follow us on Twitter, and I'll see you all in the next Servant Spotlight. Soberoni out. Later.